30 years ago today, our guest came close to being homeless. He had a spiritual experience that is, he says, struck him sober. Joe, I want to thank you so much for taking some time to join me here on a mental health break.
Vince, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
We're doing another live stream. So Trent, if you're viewing or listening on, we've got your buddy on today. So thank you for forging this connection. Joe is a true story of rags to riches to glory. He struck me with his humble persona, yet for how much he's gone through and then how much he's accomplished. It was very inspiring to me. So I can't wait to dive in here. But for everyone tuning or viewing on today, this is a mental health break. I want to thank you so much for helping make this show a top 5% global podcast with your dedicated listening each week since January 2020. If it's your first show, get ready to hear an authentic experience on mental health. His story, we'll talk about some things that worked well, some things that didn't, advice, some great lessons learned, and everything in between. Today's show is brought to you by the Empathy Card Set app. John Ford, he does it all. He's got the app, the card set. Head to theempathyset.com to get your today. And Coming Alive Podcast Production.com to start your podcast journey today. But for today, it's all things Joe. And I'd love to ask you, sir, please start your mental health journey from wherever you feel comfortable.
Very good. Well, thank you again for having me. And thanks everybody for listening. As Vincent said, I'm 30 years sober now, all these years later, and it wasn't always like this. I was one of these just normal type kids in high school, you know, the athlete, the choir singer, the A student, all those things, and did the normal types of drinking with friends, was raised in a culture where wine with every meal was normal. And it was fine, you know, nothing really interesting or different about that. Though as years went on, basically, I just realized that life wasn't really going like I wanted it to. Although the one thing I learned in college was that myself and a boss probably weren't going to get along too well. So entrepreneurship literally started right out of college, which now would be 40 years ago. And have had very successful businesses over the years. So I was a very functioning person out there, but functioning to a limited degree. And interestingly enough, it's literally 30 years ago today, February 13th, 1994, where I'm having a conversation with a buddy of mine named Lincoln. And Lincoln comes into where we were living. And at the time, I was living in an unfinished basement of a friend's house, thinking nothing of it, you know, just kind of like a normal thing. And my buddy comes in just hollering and cussing and screaming. And I'm like, Lincoln, what is wrong with you? He said, I went to this freaking meeting and you'll never guess what these people want me to do. I'm like, what? He says, they want me to go 90 days, Joe, without drinking. I'm like, you're kidding me. Like, who would even think of doing that? Like, why would anybody want to do that? Was going through my brain, right? And it was in that moment when I realized I was right before my 31st birthday. I looked back and I said, when was the last time I'd gone 90 days without drinking? And the answer was I was 14. And it was just like a ton of bricks. It was just like a board across the forehead. I had never thought about it ever. And I said, okay, I can do this. No big deal. So first day, fine. Get to day 7. And they call it white knuckling, when every part of my being wanted to drink and drug. And back then, my drug of choice was marijuana. Thank you, Jesus, that they didn't have the types of drugs that are so accessible now. I probably wouldn't be here. I just wouldn't. I end up at a buddy's house, another friend's house in South Atlanta. I'm from Atlanta. I sit down in a chair, and I was one of these people. I was raised Catholic. I have a tremendous amount of respect for Catholicism and people of religion. It just never fit for me. At 26 years old, I kind of made this pact with God that said, here's the story. I won't mess with you. You don't mess with me. I won't ask for help if I go to jail, but just leave me alone. You know, don't strike me. Don't strike me down. So anyways, I'm sitting in this chair 30 minutes. And at a certain point, all compulsions of acting out had me. And I stand up, put my hands to my side, and I say, God, if I'm not supposed to drink or drug today, I need your help. I feel a rush of energy go through my body. I feel a tear come down my left side. Compulsion's gone. 54 days later into that journey, I was in Florida on a business trip, and I had full-blown memories of being sexually abused as a kid. And that came from absolutely zero, had no idea. I was 6 years old, two 16-year-old boys and a stick, did some things that nobody would want to go through naturally. And from that moment right there driving home, I knew my life would never be the same. I got out of the business. It was a family business. I closed it down, got into direct help with a therapist that I had been working with all along, but now on a different topic, obviously. And this is the part of my journey. The next 3 years is the part of my journey on how and why I'm so clear the difference between toxic shame and shame. Toxic shame to Joe is that belief that constantly, every second of every day, badgers you. Literally, after these memories, I could not stop the voices that said, why did you let him do that? You shouldn't have done that. It was your fault. Badger constantly. And through therapy and some techniques I can give your readers later, about 3 years in, those voices let go. Not because Joe did anything, but because I had been working so hard to heal the reason, the hurt that had been in there at this point, 25 years. I'd been doing everything I needed to heal the hurt. And when the hurt wasn't hurting so bad deep inside, the big voices that were I'd call them protector parts. My counselor would say, Joe, what are they protecting you from? And I would say, all that deep hurt. I didn't want to feel all that stuff, but I had to. And so that's why I say that surrender is not an action step. It's not a light switch. I hear people out there say, you just have to surrender. I'm like, yeah, no kidding. I mean, if I could do that, I'd have done that a long time ago. And one of the things I want your listeners to learn is if there's something in their life they can't surrender, I get it. It's a process. It's not an action. It's the consequence. Well, about 7, 8 years into it now, and my path is more like the modern day monk, if you will. I took a 7-year period of time, 3 years in a row. I lived on less than $3,000 a year. I went into this processing and healing and creating a safe environment where that was the focus, period. Well, about 7, 8 years later, I come across the sister of one of my perps, and I knew these people well. Of course, I would never mention names of that group out in the public. But when she told me how he died, because he had died, I started to weep. And she told me that he was in a motorcycle wreck out in California, and he went off the side of a cliff. And when they found his body many, many days later, they realized that the accident did not kill him. So he laid there in a broken body for multiple days. And eventually he just left. And when I was weeping, because at that point, probably 7 years in, I could see this human as a hurting man, not a man who hurt me. And that took me a long time. That's why I know for Joe, forgiveness is not an action step. Forgiveness happens for whatever the experiences you're in that you can't forgive yet. The inability to forgive just means there's still hurt inside of you that needs to be grieved, that needs to be felt, that needs to have awareness to it. It doesn't make us bad because we can't forgive Johnny or Susie or whatever. It's just the process. And I tell people that if there's still something you can't forgive about somebody, right? That just means there's more work to be done in you. Now, it doesn't mean you can take your stuff out on the person. It doesn't mean you can act out on the person. It doesn't mean you can cause that other person harm. No. It just means that you have more hurt. And again, that's why I say forgiveness is the consequence. And that really happened for me. So over the next years, I found an AA program about 17 months into being dry. I was probably the only person on the planet that walked into AA and said, "Hey, I'm here. Hadn't drank for a long time, but I had no idea that a 12-step program is 12 steps to get somebody closer to a God of their understanding. Zero. I just thought 12-step were for these losers that couldn't stop drinking. Well, I was like, what the heck? If you're going to teach me how to get closer to God, I'm all in. What do I do? And so I kind of walked in, and since my story of sobriety happened in an instant, typically you go into programs and you find somebody whose background, whose story is similar to yours. I was 4.5 years into AA before I heard a man tell the story of his sponsor that was similar to mine. So for the longest time, I knew I was at the right place, but I really didn't have that connection of community because my story was so different. And my story was different because the way I got to sobriety was through the woman that taught me all of this, who has passed away 6 or 7 years ago in her late 70s. We came through the process of embracing the depths of ourselves first and then healing all of that pain. And that's where I tell people that we're a multi-dimensional being. We're not just a me. We're not just the adult Joe. There's multi-dimensions inside of us. And so frequently I hear very well-advised people that are being asked the question about emotion and healing, where they take an emotional question and give an intellectual answer. They'll be talking about, someone will ask them the question about, how do I heal my pain inside? And they'll say, well, you have to create a loving external environment. And I'm like, yeah, that's great. But if loving external environments healed the hurt, everybody would be hurtless, but we're not. So what I was taught was to give a voice to the most darkest place, to give a voice to the part hurting the most. And I'll kind of close with the action steps, and then ask me any question you want. On there are what's come up. I'm an open book. So it's one of those things to where literally, I tell people to get started on the path. You have to understand that you're a multi-dimensional being first. And the way you give a voice to the most hurting parts is that you have to write out the voice that's in your head, the shame-based voice in your head. And the writing of that out, basically what it does is as you write those voices, you'll literally be able to then hear the shame voice. And I tell people, when you're writing, there's a part that's writing and there's a part that's being written about. So right there's two of you. And we start with the limiting beliefs because those are the easy ones. My sponsor told me to do it. You know what my first belief was? I don't have any limiting beliefs. That was literally my first statement. Well, 12 legal size pages later, I was done for the first time. And I did that process a lot. The second voices that have to be written out are the critical voices. And those critical voices are the voices that you hear when Johnny Smith is playing football and he missed the touchdown, which just happened for a team of mine that I was watching, missed it. And all the voices that go through my head about that guy who did the best he could, but he missed the football anyway. All of those voices. And when I was told, for every one voice you have pointing out, you have 10 voices pointing back, I was like, oh goodness, that's not good. And that's why I was introduced to the concept of the inner child, because thinking of myself as a young boy, it's easier for me to be nice to me if I think of myself as a young boy. And that was the beginning stages of the inner child work for me. And then the last part, which is the hardest, which most people never do, is you have to find an environment with somebody that you trust where you can share these voices with somebody else. Because when you share them with somebody else, then there's the teller, the part doing the sharing. There's the part that's being spoken about. So there's a multidimensional. And you're going to have a bunch of courage to be able to have the humility to do the sharing, literally. And That's where I introduced the concept of a higher power, because especially if you're in a toxic shame position. The toxic shame position is the person that the voices have been so dramatic their whole life that their behaviors have been hateful and hurtful and harmful, period. And nobody wants to admit that stuff. Nobody. But if it stays in you, that's why it's toxic. And then it just builds upon itself. Now, I'm here to tell you the mass majority of people that don't have daily challenge with addiction, their voices are going to be simple. I'm too fat. I'm too skinny. I'm too this. I'm too that. Wrong color, wrong age. They're going to be simple, right? The guy with the toxic shame is going to say, I'm a 40 adjective, ugly word person. I'm 40 adjectives, ugly word. It's going to be much more dramatic. And where people tend to make a mistake in this, and I've heard it, this is not an action step of vulnerability. This is an action step of humility. So in other words, when you're talking and you got these voices, this is not your wife's job to listen to your voices. Your wife didn't marry your voices. Your wife married the man who is going to have love and compassion as you get on the other side of the voices. Your husband is not here to support you when through your mental challenges. That's why there's therapists. That's why there's people in programs. That's why there's people out there. Your partnership is supposed to get the reward of your healing, not be the support of your healing. And you want to be truly vulnerable with your partner. Go dump all this other stuff on somebody who is happy to listen. And then there's just so much more space to when you don't have when you have one loving voice and 10 unloving voices, it's much harder to love your partner. But as those 10 unloving voices get put out on paper, 10 goes to 5. And then you keep doing it, and then 5 goes to 3. And for the spiritual warrior out there, the person who's truly wanting to heal, the reason they have the voices, which is not everybody. Millions and millions of people live fully productive lives, and these voices don't run their life. But for the people that want to really heal the depths, that's a different story. And there's specific counselors and programs out there to support them in that process. So today, quite honestly, 30 years later, I've got a big house. I've got businesses. I've got 2 successful kids. You know, I'm giving back. I call it rags to riches to glory. Rags is when I was living on a 3-inch piece of foam in an unfinished basement, thinking everything was normal. Started doing this work, built a couple $1 million businesses, own $1 million business right now. But riches are something different than glory. What we're doing here today, you inviting me on your podcast today, this is me sharing my glory. And I'll leave it like this. I say, I'm not a doctor. I'm not a researcher. I'm not. And, and I have all respect for people in these categories. I do. But I ask people the question, if you were going to the dentist for a root canal, right? And there's 3 people in that room, but you wanted to know the experience of the root canal. Would you ask the doctor who's read every book and is really, really knowledgeable about it? Would you ask the hygienist who's the support or the researcher? She's talked to 1,000 people. Or would you ask the person that just walked out with the bulge on the side of their face because of the root canal, right? Well, I'm the guy that's been doing root canals for 30 years. And I'm not a preacher. I'm more of a teacher. I tell people take what works and leave the rest. And I'm just here to tell you, Vincent, if I can do it, anybody can do it. I mean, there's nothing special about me. Anybody can do it. So that's kind of where I'm at. And so thanks for letting me share. I can't hear you, Vince. I think you're muted on me.
Yep, I had to give you the floor. I
Sure.
think that, again, it's just so inspiring to see how you share all of that, and then you wrap it up at the end. You got the successful kids, which we talked about behind the show. You're happy with the businesses. But even here, from barely functioning to getting to that point, as he describes, white knuckling. Excuse me, I had not heard that term before. But then how you suppressed these memories, it seemed, as a kid from the sexually abused experience. Now, I'd love to ask some tips that worked, some mental health things you did to get out of that funk. And then just in general, we know the 12 steps has been extremely effective for you. but was there anything else? Was there exercise, journaling? What helped you get back to where you needed to be?
Sure. I was introduced to the concept of dual hand journaling, where dominant, non-dominant, and dominant, non-dominant basically. And I always kind of caveat the concept of the inner child, because I know there are people out there that just don't understand what it is. And it doesn't really matter. It's just, if there wasn't a hurt part inside of you, you wouldn't be watching this show. Your life would be fine. You'd be doing whatever. So what I was introduced to is the dominant, non-dominant hand journaling. So I would write with my right hand, because I'm a righty. I would write with my right hand, whatever the question might be. How are you? How are you feeling? What are you doing? How's it going? All of that. And then you pick up a pen with your non-dominant hand, and it takes 15 minutes to write 3 words. It used to. Now you should see how fast I am writing with my non-dominant hand. But that process gave a voice to the part of self, like you said, that was suppressed. And a part that's suppressed, what's the consequence in our life of suppression? It's feeling a sense of dark, feeling a sense of depression, feeling a sense of lost, lonely. And what most people do, they try to find an external solution to an internal experience. I'm lonely, I'm lost. So they try to find a friend. And then when they're around a friend and they still feel lonely and lost, they say, well, it's the friend's fault. Let me find somebody else. Well, if you think about yourself, and I've helped people through this, it's kind of like I've got 2 kids. If I put my son Ryan, when he's 7 years old, in a closet, in other words, suppressed him, what would he be experiencing in that closet as a little boy? Lost, lonely, suppressed. So giving a voice to your darkest parts starts allowing that part to feel heard, to feel integrated. Now, of course, the challenge is you give that part a safe environment and a voice long enough, you're probably going to have to feel the feelings that are suppressed in that. Mm-hmm. That's why when somebody is ready, they need to have somebody they can call and somebody they can pace, a safe environment. I am not suggesting you do this alone. In fact, I learned years ago, where 2 or more are gathered, God is present. Well, that's in sobriety, that's in baseball hitting, and that's in embracing the depths of your pain. But how did I get started? Dual hand journaling. And it really, really helped. And it also helped when my counselor told me that we're an emotional being: mad, glad, sad, and scared. Not just glad and not just happy, and we're sad and scared and angry also. And when she taught me tips to get my anger out, you have to understand, I'm still 220 now. I'm 6 foot 220. The difference back then, my 220 that's in my belly was in my chest. Literally. Look at my son online. You'll see me 30 years ago. I was the type of, I would smoke marijuana in a cigarette out in public, knowing that nobody had the courage to walk up to me because I was bigger than everybody. That was just that massive personality. So when I walk into a Target to buy a toy for my inner child, I'm walking around with this, and I said, I dare anybody to ask me who this teddy bear is for, right? Well, it just reminded me that there's a little boy in me also, an inner self in me also. Give that part a voice, and you're going to feel different.
I had that in here too, giving the voice to the parts that's hurting. And I absolutely love that. Before I let you go, though, before we get, you know what? We actually have to stop a second. We didn't even talk about the books. This conversation has been flying by. We're going to have him on Writing with Authors, everyone, coming soon. Of course, you heard he's an entrepreneur. We'll get him on that entrepreneur show too, so you can get to know our guests from all different sides. Some of these books they're mental health related, so let's touch on these quickly.
Sure. The first book, which is going to be published March 18th, is called Healing Addiction: Freedom from Shame Through 12-Step Inner Child Connection. And basically, it's my story. It's what we shared here, just in 275 pages. How that book was written. I'm a math guy. Talk to me about math. I can do it in my head. I wasn't a writer. I wasn't. Well, I'd hear this voice in my head that said, it's time to write. I'm like, no, I'm not. It's time to write, Joe. No, I'm not. I'm literally in a battle. I wasn't talking to anybody in my bedroom by myself. I'm in a battle. And then the voice said, if you don't write, you're not sleeping. I was like, what? Of course, all sorts of adjectives, right? Which I won't say here. All right, I'll start writing. And soulmates came through me. So my whole book took me 22 months. I don't claim it because it wasn't me. It was something coming through me. I have the pages of paper, 275 legal size pages that started from word one to 103,000 words just dictated through me 25 years ago. The second book, that book used to be called Your Inner Child Has Rights Too. I'm being published now by Freeland Publishing. And Tom was like, you know, Joe, we need to create a title that is more inclusive for people, healing addiction. Right. And even though my story is about addiction recovery, truly my story is about walking out of shame. Because shame is the ultimate experience that all different types of actions that you wish you could stop, drinking, sexing, eating, all of those things, they're all based in shame. I mean, literally 25 years that book was in there. The second book, Awaken Greatness, is what we would talk about more on the other. Awaken Greatness is more about limiting beliefs. Healing addiction is more about toxic shame. And again, I thought 30 years ago, 25 years ago, I would be doing this. Well, podcast didn't exist 25 years ago, literally. So that book was just kind of put in a box, literally, and how God works in people's lives. September 21st, 2022, I'm listening to a podcast of a woman that I had seen online, met online, and I hear her story. And she says, you know, I've had a great career. I've sold my multi-million-dollar business. My 2 kids are launched to college, and my only failure is my divorce. Right. I hear this huge voice in my head that says, you didn't fail at your divorce. You chose to live your divinity over your humanity. In other words, you and your partner's spiritual paths went separate directions. Unequally Yoked is the book I probably mentioned there that came through. And then I was like, geez, I've got these other 2 books. I should go find them. I don't know. And I'll close with this. Do you know what a 100 meg floppy disk is?
I do.
Okay. Well, try to find somebody who can get data off a 100 meg floppy disk.
I don't even, they've got the converters, but you don't have any. I never see one with the disk space in it.
Yeah. It took me 4 months to find a guy, literally, because that's how it was stored. Both books were stored there. Now they're out. Freeland Publishing is going to have them out to people. I have a free download of it too, if I can mention that. Spiritwalkers.com will be up here very soon. My overarching company is Spirit Walkers, and spiritwalkers.com has a free download to Healing Your Addiction. Just go there and click, and you know it'll download. I'm not asking for email address. I'm not asking for anything. Just if you need it and you want it, get it there. For a lot of people, you know, if they want it in book form, you know, they'll be able to buy it in book form there too, or on their Kindle. This just PDFs it right on their computer. So spiritwalkers.com, you know, people can get the book for free.
Thank you for sharing that. That's very admirable. And before we let you go, since we know where to find you online now, what's one piece of advice, Joe, you can offer to anyone out there who may be struggling today?
Remember that wherever you are, you're okay. And if you're struggling with forgiveness, that's fine. If you're struggling with surrender, of course. If you've got all these massive voices that are just burying you, write them down. The writing down of the voices, bullet point, bullet point, bullet point, will give a sense of freedom. And understand that this is not a journey for the weak-hearted. This is not supposed to be easy. My message is never a message of hope and I'm going to give. No, when I tell people to pray, I tell people to pray for strength, because walking through the reason that you're having a hard time, there's a reason inside. It takes strength and it takes consistency over time. If you look behind me, that picture, that's an 18,000 piece puzzle that I did. And it took me 4 years to do it. Consistency over time. And this process is the same. So I want people to know that wherever they are, they're there for a reason. Pray for strength. It might not be tomorrow that you're relieved of everything. It might not be. But if you keep going and you keep doing it and know that sometimes the greatest answers come in your darkest day, that then you'll know that you're in the right place, even though it feels horrible. So write them down, find support, keep going, and understand that if you're even on a program like this, who comes here except people searching for something? That you're unique. You're unique, a true spiritual warrior. And when people see themselves as a true spiritual warrior who is walking through the depths of pain, hey, I've been there. I was there. And now I'm not.
And you gave it your all today. I can't thank you enough, Joe. I mean, we talked about so much. Again, everyone giving a voice to that part that's hurting yourself, going from barely functioning but finding a way. I mean, he said living on a 3-inch piece of foam in the basement. Hey, we're all good. This is life. He got himself out of that funk, and he shared all that today. Be sure to stick around for his Writing with Authors coming soon. We'll get him on that entrepreneur show after those two because these are impactful. But this is a mental health break. Be sure to subscribe for the next episode. We're on all social media platforms as well if you want to show us some love there. My name is Vincent A. Lancey, and you can learn about me at vincentalancy.com. Today's partner is John Ford with his empathyset.com, his empathy card set. He has an empathy app in the App Store, and Coming Alive podcastproduction.com to start your journey today. But with that, we are signing off today. Joe, thank you so much for stopping by.
Thanks for having me.